Let's go. We're almost ready. Check. Yo, we about ready. Let's go. What's up, y'all? Tonight we're covering dragons. We're doing a dragon theme. So tonight we're covering John Gardner's Grendel. This is a novel about the epic poem Beowulf. Now, we've already covered Beowulf here a while back, but we're going to go back through it. We're going to cover Beowulf, the novel Grendel, which is Seamus Heaney's Beowulf. I'm going to be talking about Seamus Heaney a little bit with the spirit level, and then Anglo-Saxon and Old English. And this is my thank you. Audio's working good. This is my a book from when I was in university at Queen's University Belfast. This is Hugh McGinnis, my two professors, Hugh McGinnis and Ivan Urbison's Discovering Old English. They wrote the book on Old English. And then we're going to be talking about some dragon films. We're going to be going into Reign of Fire, Dragonslayer, Dragonheart, maybe a little bit of SMAUG. And yeah, so we're going to be talking about the theme of dragons in Anglo-Saxon and Old English. And I'm going to be using again John Gardner's Grendel as a guide for this. Now, this is a good book, and I picked it up randomly because I was just thinking about Seamus Heaney and about the translation of Beowulf, and then of course this is a 1971 novel. So the epigraph comes from William Blake, and so that plays into the theme here. We're going to see that like most of the literature that we've done, we're going to see as sort of a spider web of the landscape of literature. And it's good to get out of the postmodern theme that we've been doing so much. However, those sort of serve as prerequisites for this John Gardner book because it's interesting because the John Gardner book really takes it. You would think it would be annoying. Okay, so let's start off. You would think this book would be annoying because it is a 1971 book where we get a characterization of Grendel, and yet it's not an origin story. It's really like again, it's sort of a postmodern Sartrean look at the way that this Anglo-Saxon epic plays out. And of course, in Beowulf, we get the themes of Christianity versus paganism. And we've talked about that before in the original Beowulf stream. But I'm going to go back over today, and I think it's interesting because that first analysis we discussed mainly kind of the first two parts of the epic of Beowulf, because the first two parts are about um, when Beowulf and the Geats get to um, talk to Hrothgar. They come over all the way. They talk to Hrothgar and the Danes, and they're trying to help him, rid the kingdom of Grendel, who's this monster. Then we talk about Grendel's mother, but the dragon is the third and final sort of culminating point of the epic, and it's the foundation for Anglo-Saxon, for English literature. It's the foundation for Anglo-Saxon literature. Anglo-Saxon, we've talked about how. So I'm just going to go back through really quickly how Anglo-Saxon affects English. Okay, so English is it's a Germanic language, right? So it's not. So we're not talking about Romance languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Instead, we get something interesting with the history of English. We get the Angles and the Saxons and the great hordes of Vikings and Norsemen invading all parts of, in this case, Western Europe. They fan out throughout Europe. The Celts sort of coming from Central Europe and like a modern Switzerland, as I understand it. But we get them going over to the British Isles, and we get the Danes, the Angles, the Saxons. Later, we get all sorts of Northmen. We get the Celts going over to Ireland. We have the Gauls. We have the Franks, and so it's interesting how English is a Proto-Germanic language that is almost phonetic. German is almost phonetic to English and develops into something that doesn't look like English when you read Beowulf. I had to translate Beowulf. The first day in the class in my final year of university at Queens, I walked in and I had this professor, Hugh McGinnis, and he ran the whole class in Anglo-Saxon. He spoke fluent Anglo-Saxon, and it's kind of like when you go to a Spanish class and you're in sixth grade. They're like, "We're going to do the whole class in Spanish. You have to speak in Spanish, but you don't really." Well, he spoke in Old English. And so our main task for the rest of the semester was to translate Beowulf, and we used his own book as a guide. This other guy, Ivan Urbison, was really funny because he helped write the book on it, but he also I took a class with him right after that. Um, and that was an Icelandic saga class. We're going to get to that later because we're doing a stream on sagas. So what's interesting is not only the formation of the language, because Old English will then develop into Middle English with Chaucer, and then finally we get modern English. The beginning of the origins of modern English with Shakespeare and the King James Bible, and then that is the English that we speak. Now, we've done so much on Elizabethan literature that it's not. We don't really need to go back to it here, but what's really interesting is the values that we get in terms of a paradigm for the English epic and for English Anglo-Saxon values that come out of this really this one text. And Beowulf is like an 800 to 1000 AD text, and there's one copy. I think it's in the Bodleian Library, and then we get this novel, this 1971 novel. I was really impressed by this book because there's really no need for it. There's it's not like it specifically fills in a gap in the time in which it was written, but it is increasingly relevant to now because what we're going to see is that the book discusses a kind of it's pretty good because it discusses Grendel's worldview, which we don't really care about in the Beowulf epic, in a kind of latter day 20th century Jean-Paul Sartre existentialist mindset. And that'll make sense as I go through it. The epigraph is from William Blake, and that will play a role with us because William Blake, of course, did The Great Red Dragon and The Woman Clothed in the Sun as part of his engraving set. If I've seen the picture in person, the watercolor in person, and it is amazing. Now, that also plays a role in the book Red Dragon. We've done Thomas Harris's Karamori, which is on from Red Dragon and from Hannibal and Silence of the Lambs. So if you want to go back and check that out, we should do probably a Red Dragon, just a Red Dragon stream. But I'm just going to kind of reference that. There are too many dragons to cover in one stream about dragons. I mean, there's so many dragons, and you know what's interesting is that the dragons play a role throughout world culture. You know, we could talk about Japanese and Chinese dragons, and of course we're not gonna really touch on that, but we are gonna talk about how the dragon represents Satan, and we think about the way that Lucifer is described in Ezekiel, and then finally the great dragon in Revelation, and that obviously is playing a role in Beowulf. So the dragon is going to work literally, literally and figuratively, metaphorically within these texts. So the epigraph comes from William Blake, and it says, "And if the babe is born a boy, he's given to an old woman who nails him down upon a rock, catches his shrieks in cups of gold." Okay, so what I was really impressed with was with this novel, and this isn't a review; we're doing an analysis of it. But what I was really impressed with this the most was the fact that Gardner, in the guise of Grendel, who is the speaker in this, sticks to the kind of the the what can I call this? The cadence that we get in Beowulf. Now you remember that Beowulf the epic is written with the verse lines of the caesura, right? So we get the caesura in the midst of the line. And we've talked about that in other streams. So we talked about that in terms of literature and epic poems. But the caesura is essentially where instead of something like a an Elizabethan epic, right? Or which would be iambic pentameter, which is again setting the line of verse sets the tone and the format for how we view the world. Because in terms of, especially in terms of the Renaissance and the Elizabethan way of looking at sort of duality, right? We get up and down, right? We get left and right. We get dialectics, and we get the I am, which is unstressed, stressed, and we get a specific mathematical form for the line. And when the line of verse variates from that, then it shows that it has to match the content. We have Latin hexameters when we talk about, or sorry, we have Greek hexameters, and then when we talk about Homer, and then we also have so every epic has a verse form that fits with it. Now we also have one of the things about the epic poem is that the epic has to contain an epic hero, which means for us that the epic hero has to be a Christ-like figure. They have to represent virtue and defense of the people and lifting the people up, but they also are they're a great defender and they're a great warrior. And unlike for instance, the Shakespearean tragedy where we have a hero who falls from a high place to a low place, um, we get sweeping exterior landscapes and changes in the contours of the land and time because those are supposed to be exterior symbols of what takes place in the interior life of the epic hero. In Beowulf, it's interesting because it's different from all the other epics. Every epic is kind of in the spirit of the nation, but sort of before there are nations. Now we at times there are nations because we have, of course, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek. Then we have the Aeneid for the Romans. It's the epic hero of the Romans, epic poem of the Romans. We have the Song of Roland for France. We've got El Cid for Spain. But what does England have? Well, England has something that's different because the hero comes from elsewhere. Now, this is in a way, um, this is sort of it's a quasi-religious allegory because we get a grand hero with a bunch of disciples who comes from elsewhere into the land and everyone flocks to the person. That's what happens in Beowulf. Um, Grendel is interesting because in a way we what he does is instead of having verse like he writes his book in prose, obviously it's a novel, but it really sticks to the kind of it's not a rhyme scheme, but the rhyme scheme in the original Beowulf is formed by the alliteration, the alliterative, the repeating consonants on either side of the caesura. A caesura is a break in the middle of the line, and this is named such because of when you think Caesar and his life cut short, right? So we have a writer writing with a line of verse. It's like a timeline, and then it's cut short in the middle, and then we continue on. There's a great, my favorite word, abyss in the middle of the line, but this is translated, it's a not I would say maybe it's transliterated into prose. And he does a really great job of it sounds so lame to say he does a great job. I mean, so much more than that. It's really fantastic and sweeping and visceral how he manages to keep his speaker's monologue in the same sort of continuity as the speaker in Beowulf. Now, in Beowulf, the speaker is going to be a Scop, right? He's a bard who's telling the story of Beowulf to to the followers. But in this, we have the lone voice of Grendel in the darkness. And I think that that is fitting for the time because it becomes this sort of egocentric meditation on what he wants and why things aren't fair. And we see that's why Grendel in this becomes this I mean, really, he's a psychopathic, monstrous serial killer. That's what he is in the book Grendel. And we can sort of look at him through that lens in Beowulf. So we also have a sort of a mixture of the present tense and the past tense in this, and it's interesting because the book will really become fully present tense when we are caught up to the present, which is what we know of Beowulf. Beowulf himself only appears in the book at the very end, and that's interesting because again, it's not like a Joker origin story. Instead, it's like like an egocentric meditation on why this monster is the way that he is. And really it's funny because you start to read this and you go, is this guy an incel? Is he a he's literally he lives in his mother's basement. Right? That's where Grendel lives. He lives in the mire. And remember that Beowulf, in order to get to Grendel, has to walk into the fen and then dive into the pool, into the Jeff brought that up, my other favorite word, into the Stygian blackness of this what becomes this Dantean inverted world of where Grendel has been cast out. So at the beginning of Beowulf, we get a description of how it's a sort of a paraphrase or a retelling of Genesis. Now, I was just writing a something about I was just writing I'll just say I was just writing something recently and I thought of um, what Ezra Pound says in Hugh Selwyn Moberly. He says better mendacities than the classics in paraphrase. Well, Beowulf kind of violates that because we do get Genesis in paraphrase, but um it becomes its own voice because we have an Anglo-Saxon bard telling the story of Genesis in verse to people who are in the pagan audience are unaware of it. And Beowulf also represents, it's like it takes place at a sort of a nexus point between paganism and Christianity in a chaotic Europe, which again we get order out of this. So he begins, he says, the old ram stands looking down over slides, stupidly triumphant. I blink. I stare in horror. Scat, I hiss. Go back to your cave. Go back to your cowshed, whatever. He cocks his head like an elderly, slow witted king, considers the angles, decides to ignore me. I stamp. I hammer the ground with my fists. I hurl a skull sized stone at him. He will not budge. I shake my two hairy fists at the sky, and I let out a howl so unspeakable that the water at my feet turns sudden ice. And even I, myself, am left uneasy. But the ram stays. The season is upon us. And so begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. The pain of it, the stupidity. So there's a lot that's going on in this first paragraph. And yes, the 13th Warrior is a good movie, roughly based on Beowulf. Actually, I just rewatched the 13th Warrior this week, and I was thinking of doing an analysis on it because of this, but I decided not to because it sort of lacks the dragon. But that led me to Beowulf. Um, the 13th Warrior is Grendel is kind of a retelling of the 13th Warrior, which is a retelling of Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, which is a retelling of Beowulf. And that one's interesting because it brings in the Islamic element from the outside because of the speaker in the 13th Warrior. And it sort of humanizes Beowulf and takes the metaphysics out of it in a way, but it's a fun movie. Um, so what we get in this paragraph is pretty interesting because the old ram is number one. We're going to see that later on Grendel is going to attack this ram um at near the climax, and he's going to smash the skull with a rock, with a skull-sized rock of this animal because he can't get to Beowulf and his band. So we also have the alliteration which marks the beginning of the tone of Beowulf, and we also have a bunch of characteristics in this that are foreshadowing what's later going to happen. For instance, we have the elderly, slow-witted king, which is going to be a description of Hrothgar, who whom Beowulf is sent to help, or who comes to help. And then we also have, it's interesting because the mention of the word scat is, I'm sure, an intentional pun here, because Grendel lives in this stinking bog, right? And he's a creature of filth. He also says, and so begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. Well, it's a war that he makes, but he blames it on the men. And the number 12 is important because 12 disciples, and we're also going to have the 12 books of an epic, and there are 12 chapters in this book. He says the pain, the stupidity of it. Um, let's see. I wrote, also the characterization, the setting, and the water and ice. Uh, I don't know. I think people that I tell this to are usually surprised, but because it seems like it would be something that would be right up my alley that I would love. But I really don't watch Game of Thrones. I mean, I watched a couple episodes of the like newest iteration of it or whatever, but I really have not watched Game of Thrones, so I don't know A Song of Fire and Ice. Of course, we talked about Fire and Ice and the Robert Frost poem and the psychotic Robert Frost Robert Frost poet stream, and obviously George R.R. Martin takes a lot from J.R.R. Tolkien, and actually, we're gonna see that the movie Dragonslayer was hugely influential on George R.R. Martin. Now, I just know the dynamics of the dragon and all that. I don't really know the story. So when we could do a whole Game of Thrones analysis, I'm sure, and when you see dragons, people probably nowadays think that automatically. But I know that that's like a good example of what this is, sort of synthesized into one thing. But but yeah, so I think that we're going to see a lot of that. And also what I saw was that there was a lot that the movie Beowulf took from this novel Grendel, and they did not take it from Beowulf. I wondered where the elements were in the film Beowulf that came out, the one with what's his name? Ray you guys, what's the name of the guy who is plays Beowulf in the film? Ray. Oh my god, I can't think of his name. And I have a friend who is best friends with his daughter in England. I can't think of his name. Ray Winstone? Right. Ray Winstone. My name's Ray Winstone. I'm Beowulf. He says that like 400. So Beowulf the movie came out at a time when it came out in like I think 2007 or 2008, and that is at a time, if you notice, that it's around the same time that 300 came out. And what's interesting about the correlation between 300 and Beowulf is that the epic hero, the protagonist, the main character in both of those, has to repeat who they are like 400 times in each movie, right? Um, I mean, when he says, "This is Sparta," this is Sparta, right? When he says, "This is Sparta," he's really talking about himself, like that I am Sparta. You know, what's his name? Leonidas represents Sparta, but in Beowulf, Ray Winstone literally says, I am, I am winner, thrasher, wolf." All right, so he took a lot of that. They took a lot of liberties from the poem, but they used a lot of it from this novel. I never realized. I always thought this was like a young adult novel when I saw it, so I kind of avoided it. But it's not that. It just happens to be one that I guess can appeal to teens to make an easier, to help them make headway through the epic poem Beowulf. But it's actually good. It's a good novel for adults. Um, let's see. I wrote here this paragraph is supposed to mimic or mirror the Anglo-Saxon verse stanza. So let's look at that. He says, "Ah, well, I sigh and trudge back to the trees. Do not think my brains are squeezed shut like the rams by the root of thorns. Um, Flanks a tremble, eyes like stones. He stares at as much of the world as he can and feels it surging in him, filling his chest as the melting snow fills dried out creek beds, tickling his gross. I'm not going to read that. And charging his brains with the same unrest that made him suffer last year at this time, and the year before, and the year before that. He's forgotten them all. His hind parts shiver with the usual joyful, mindless ache to mount whatever happens near, the storm piling up black towers to the west, some rotting docile stump, some spraddle-legged yew. I cannot bear to look. Why can't these creatures discover a little dignity? I ask the sky. The sky says nothing predictably. I make a face, uplift a defiant middle finger, and give an obscene little kick. The sky ignores me, forever unimpressed. Him, too, I hate, the same as I hate these brainless budding trees, these brattling birds. Do you how it mimics the original form of Beowulf? Now he starts to meditate on men here verbally to himself. It's a great soliloquy. The whole book is basically a dramatic monologue. Not, of course, that I fool myself with thoughts that I'm more noble. Pointless, ridiculous monster crouched in the shadows, stinking of dead men, murdered children, martyred cows. I'm neither proud nor ashamed to understand. One more dull victim, leering at seasons that never were meant to be observed. Ah, sad one, poor old freak, I cry and hug myself and laugh, letting out salt tears. Hee hee, till I fall down gasping and sobbing. It's mostly fake. The sun spins mindlessly overhead. The shadows lengthen and shorten as if by plan. Small birds with a high pitched yelp lay eggs. The tender grasses peek up innocent yellow through the ground. The children of the dead. It was just this shocking green that once, when the moon was tombed in clouds, I tore off sly old Athelgard's head, here where the startling tiny jaws of crocuses snap at the late winter sun like the heads of baby water snakes. Here I killed the old woman with the iron gray hair. She tasted of urine and spleen, which made me spit. Sweet mulch for yellow blooms. Such are the tiresome memories of a shadow shooter, earth rim roamer, walker of the world's weird wall. Wah! I cry with another quick, nasty face. Okay, so what I wasn't just reading that, for fun there. What the reason that I'm reading it is because the cadence is supposed to it gets you into a kind of a wave, and it's supposed to mimic the way that Beowulf, the Scop draws the audience, both the literal audience listening to the bardic poem, but also the figurative audience, which would be us listening through time on through the page. The way that we're drawn into this epic. And it's almost hypnotic. Do you get it? It's almost hypnotic. It's like we go up and down, it's undulating. And that's mixed in with the hard cacophonous sounds that we get through the alliteration. And that gives us a sense of ease and trusting what this speaker is saying. But the whole point is that, again, we're going to learn that we have an unreliable narrator here. We just learned that because remember, he said that he does all this stuff and he falls down gasping and sobbing, but then says it's mostly fake. It's an act. So it's an act. We're getting some of the truth of this. What's Tolkien study say? I then put on the vinyl record of Elliott Smith. I'm sorry to drop into the chat. I just saw Elliott Smith's name. And I love Elliott Smith, and I'll just say that the best Elliott Smith line, which is one that sticks with me all the time, is the moon is a light bulb breaking. It's like one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in a song. The moon is a light bulb breaking. It's in the song. I was gonna say the poem. It's in the song St. Ides Heaven, when he's walking through Alphabet City. And he's high on amphetamine, he says in the song, and the moon is a light bulb breaking. It's a beautiful, tragic song. I saw Elliott Smith in concert right before he died. So anyway, I remember I remember the day he died. He died, let's see, it was like November. It was um November 2003. And I remember what I've got an Elliott Smith biography behind me. Anyway, so So what happens is we learn that also the kennings in this, we get a continuous mention of we get things described in terms of the Anglo-Saxon kenning, which is basically where instead of a long description of person in terms of something else or an action, we get it down to a two or a three-word phrase, which becomes a title separated by dashes. So, for example, Earth Rim Roamer. Later on, he will say, let me find another example of a kenning here. He says on page 116, um, Hell Roads Runner. Yeah, Hell Roads Runner, Earth Rim Roamer again. And we get this in Tolkien. Because of the description, especially of objects like swords, skull slicer. We just got skull smasher at the beginning of this. Cut to page 20, and I wrote Grendel is a kind of a Frankenstein, whereas whereas Frankenstein is DID from the alchemical. I can't even read my own writing over all the notes. The alchemical something of demonic occult rituals. Grendel is a split demon from direct Cain. Okay, so remember that Grendel is a direct descendant of Cain, and he says here, um, he goes. So what happens is Grendel in this goes back to basically. So what happens is Grendel is like roaming around the fen and the bog, and he is killing cattle, killing sheep until he comes across man, and he always goes back to hide with his mother in the basement, and his mother is kind of absent. She doesn't really pay attention to him much. So he goes out to seek a kind of a mentor, a father figure in the dragon. He's going to find the dragon. The dragon is going to have the most dramatic section of the book, because the dragon will tell him about the history of the world, because the dragon is old. He's an old dragon. And he's going to tell him about the history of the world and how he was there from the beginning. We kind of get this in Dragonheart, where Draco, the Sean Connery dragon, talks about how the dragons are the watchers from the stars, which is it's interesting that Dragonheart becomes a Blavatsky movie. But he the dragon's gonna tell him, basically in this nihilistic spirit, um that he was there from the beginning, everything that he's learned is a lie, and that there's nothing to be done except wait for the end of the world and sit on gold. And so it's always interesting, the contradictions in these books, because when we get to the kind of Jean-Paul Sartre existentialist or Nietzschean nihilistic um cosmology, it's always about taking the religious viewpoint and paradigm and saying, "Oh, yeah, this is true, but it's actually the other way, and there's nothing to be done." So they're still buying into the religious paradigm, which shows that Grendel is truly who we've learned that he is. It's not who he says he is; it's who we learned in Beowulf that he is, which is the spawn of Cain, and he just is simply trying to find himself. And when he finds himself, he enacts exactly what the speaker of Beowulf says that he has been the whole time, which is this demon, um, greedily massacring people for the sake of destruction and death and chaos. Um, this says, let's see. Let me find a good section here. Let me skip to one of the Gnostic sections in the book. Um, this is when he's talking to the dragon, and the dragon says to him, "Don't look so bored. Think how I must feel." I almost said, "I'm sorry," but caught myself. "Man," he said, then left a long pause, letting scorn build up in the cave like the venom of his breath. "I can see you understand them. Counters, measures, theory makers. All pigs eat cheese. Old Snaggle is a pig. If Snaggle is sick and refuses to eat, try cheese. Games, games, games," he snorted fire. "They only think they think. No total vision, total system, merely schemes with a vague family resemblance, no more identity than bridges and, say, spider webs. But they rush across chasms on spider webs, and sometimes they make it, and think they think settles that. I could tell you 1,000 tiresome stories of their absurdity. They'd map out roads through hell with their crackpot theories. They're here to the moon and back lists of paltry facts. Insanity, the simplest insanity ever devised. Simple facts in isolation and facts to connect them. Ands and buts are the sine qua non of all their glorious achievement, but there are no such facts. Connectedness is the essence of everything. It doesn't stop them, of course. They build the whole world out of teeth, deprived of bodies to chew on or be chewed on. But what's interesting is that is exactly what he is doing, right? That's what the dragon's MO is. And he talks about connectedness is everything, but he was just talking about how they make the world out of to resemble spider webs, but they don't have any grounds to stand on. He says they this is page 64 of the book. They sense that, of course, from time to time have uneasy feelings that all they live by is nonsense. Here's the Gnostic part. Um, They have dim apprehensions that such propositions as God does not exist are somewhat dubious, at least in comparison with statements like all carnivorous cows eat meat. That's where the shaper saves them, provides an illusion of reality, puts together all their facts with a gluey wine of connectedness, mere tripe, believe me. Remember who's speaking this. This is the dragon speaking this. This is the Satan dragon. Mere sleight of wits, he knows no more than they do about total reality. Less, if anything, works with the same old clutter of atoms, the givens of his time and place and tongue, but he spins it all together with harp runs and hoots, and they think what they think is alive, think heaven loves them. It keeps them going for what it's worth. As for myself, I can hardly bear to look. So the dragon is trying to mentor Grendel at this point to accept who he is by his nature, which is the destroyer. And the shaper, capital S, is supposed to be the name for the scop or the bard or the poet that Grendel has been listening to from the outside tell the story of himself and of the world. But what the shaper, we can see that the shaper is also kind of just another name for a kind of a Masonic architect in the paradigm that the dragon is telling Grendel to look into. What he's referring here to, by the way, is the beginning of Beowulf. And so I thought I would read just from the very beginning because it's probably the most famous part of Beowulf. And it begins, so or low or what. It's actually the word what, HWAET, which doesn't have a direct translation, but it's like the bard is standing up in the group and he's saying, "Yo, listen up," or "Wait," or "Low," or "So." And he says, "So the Spear Danes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Chieftain, scourge of many tribes." He talks about their ancestry. Afterwards, a boy child was born to Shield, a cub in the yard, a comfort sent by God to that nation. He knew what they had sold, the long times and troubles they come through without a leader. Um, Sold is a sort of an Ulster Anglo-Saxon word that Seamus Heaney is using. So the Lord of life, the glorious Almighty, made this man renowned. Shield had fathered a famous son. Beo's name was known through the north. And a young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely while his father lives, so that afterwards in age when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand by him and hold the line. Behavior that's admired in the path to power among people everywhere. So he talks about the Lord of life giving and setting the universe in motion. And then we get let's see, we get the beginning of where Grendel came from. So it says, "Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet, telling with mastery of man's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth a gleaming plain girdled with waters in his splendor. He set the sun and the moon to be earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves and quickened life and every other thing that moved." So you get it how this is an Anglo-Saxon folk retelling of Genesis. He says, "So times were pleasant for the people there until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon haunting the marshes, marauding around the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters. Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts for the killing of Abel, and the eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. So after nightfall, Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the ring Danes were settling into it after their drink." So what he says here is that the origin of Grendel comes, his origin is that, and we can look to, again, we can look to Ezekiel for this. It's like when, um, let me read the part from Ezekiel that talks about this. He says, let's see. Remember, Lucifer is described as having every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes were prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise, they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore, I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God. We also get this, remember, in Dante and in Paradise Lost. So we get Lucifer in his pride, shining like a diamond, which is what we get, by the way, as the description of the dragon. And oftentimes, Tolkien, they do a good job in this of in the Desolation of Smaug, showing the dragon kind of shining like shimmering gold. Also in Reign of Fire, when he first goes down in the basement of this, he goes down into the bowels under London. They're digging, and he sees young Christian Bale goes down there and sees, like, it's a boy version. He goes down and like touches the wall and the wall is like glittering and shining, and he thinks it's just an old rock wall, but it's actually the scales of the dragon. And then that lights up like fire. So what we get is that we get Lucifer like that, shining, and then we get in his pride making war on God and his angels, Michael casting Satan out of hell, falling down into the ninth circle in Dante, or falling down onto the banks of the river of fire and Stygian blackness in Paradise Lost and adamantine chains. And from that, for Beowulf, we get an Anglo-Saxon folk version of this as a both a way to I assume that this is both a way to it's both literal and figurative. It's telling them this is where evil is, this is where evil comes from, and evil is something that exists in as a shadow out of the light of God by choice. Also, this is like the thing that is plaguing the land. This becomes an Arthurian theme, right? Where we have the Fisher King um, has been has been lanced, right, and has been injured, and so the land suffers and becomes a wasteland, and you have to restore the Fisher King through the Grail. The Grail is the Eucharist. So you have to restore the Fisher King to the light of God, and then you'll restore the landscape, right? We also have the fact that, yes, Tolkien says evil is also dazzling. We have the fact that people choose, there's a constant invader, but we also have the savior coming from outside. We have a constant, uh, you know, motion of peoples going across the British Isles. We have we have a kind of a kind of folk evangelism to people that literally don't know the Bible. We're talking about ancient pagan peoples in the British Isles, and so they're learning about the ways of God. So it's multifunctional, but it's interesting that this exists as both a verbal auditory poem in a folk tradition and literally on paper. So we have the one copy of Beowulf, right? And that stands for the kind of epic notion of where these people will go and what they will stand for. Poems are again meant to be seen on the page, and they're meant to be heard. They're meant to be experienced in two ways. And it's awesome that we have that. I mean, it's the same thing with the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? They're auditory poems. They're verbal. They're Homeric bardic poems that Homer would memorize the entire. That's why it's hexameters, because it's easier for the poet to memorize his poem. And I assume it's the same with this until eventually a monk writes it down. So one thing about Beowulf that scholars sort of argue over is how much of the poem is actually an original pagan poem and then is edited or revised by a monk. I actually think it just exists again at this sort of matrix between the culture class, like two gigantic epics, two movements in history where we have a Stone Age Iron Age druidical pagan land that is then overtaken by Christianity, and so we get this brief period where it's like the two are intermingled until it goes on full bore. I mean, remember that in Iceland we have a specific pagan people until they decide to Christianize all at once. I think that was in the year 1000 AD. So it's like this enormous clash of people, just like we have the clash between Grendel and Beowulf, or just like we have the clash in the book Grendel um, between himself and who he comes from and who he wants to be. He decides to take the dark way on purpose because his dragon mentor leads him to do that. Now, another thing is that I realized is that you know it seems it's pretty obvious that Beowulf that the three villains or the three stages of the epic in Beowulf are supposed to be a an inversion of the Trinity, right? Or at least it's a sort of a Gnostic pantheon, because we get the dragon who is kind of like the father, and then we get Grendel who's the son, but then we get Grendel's mother who's like Sophia, right? The Gnostic Sophia principle. Also, in the dragon, it's interesting that in the sort of artwork that's depicted of the dragon and the way that we get him depicted in movies, specifically in Reign of Fire, is as a kind of an inverted Trinitarian symbol, because we always see the dragon's two wings, and then we have we have two wings spread out, and then we get it going down with the tail, right, with this sort of serpentine tail. I'm probably reading too far into the sort of artistic base, not based, but base iconography of the way the dragon is depicted. But I think that has to be on purpose. I mean, the dragon is biblical, right? The dragon is mentioned in the Bible. Remember in Revelation. And the Revelation. Remember, Blake is showing us his red dragon as a dualistic Gnostic version of Revelation with two sort of equal sides. I mean, we have the woman clothed with the sun and then the dragon, but we also see the dragon mentioned specifically in a purely revelatory light within the holy text. So let's see. I'm just going to point out some other passages in this before I move on to the movies. Um Yeah, we have the inverted a lot of this is Joseph Campbell, a lot of this book is Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, but we get it in an inverted sense. So, we get a protagonist who's actually the antagonist, right? Because it's the villain, but the protagonist who comes from a kind of a lowly place, goes through a transformation, discovers who he is, and then has to achieve something. Um, and he says in this, let's see, on page 80, we get it was as if I'd made some incredible this is the hero's journey here, but it's an inverted hero's journey. It was as if I'd made it's Miltonian, some incredible discovery, like my discovery long ago of the moonlit world beyond the mirror. Get it? Moonlit mirror, the alliterative caesura, Anglo-Saxon verse line. I was transformed. I was a new focus for the clutter of space I stood in. If the world had once imploded on the tree where I waited, trapped and full of pain, it now blasted outward away from me, screeching terror. I had become myself the mama I'd searched the cliffs for once in vain. That merely hints at what I mean. I had become something as if born again. I had hung between possibilities before, between the old truths I knew and the heart sucking conjuring tricks of the shaper. Now that was past. I was Grendel, ruiner of mead halls, wrecker of kings, but also as never before, I was alone. So again, we have a post postmodern Sartre existentialist version of being and nothingness of being and becoming, and where he specifically uses the mentor's dynamism in words, aka the dragon, to tell him that it's okay to be the villain and to achieve, to live your truth essentially, right? Until finally he is destroyed. He's destroyed by the actual hero in Beowulf. He says, I do not complain of it. Talking, talking, complaining, complaining, filling the world I walk with words. It also kind of reminds me of the way the underground man talks. Remember, shouts out to Tristan, in Notes from the Underground when we were talking about Dostoevsky. But I admit it was a jolt. It was a few raids later, the mead hall door burst open at my touch, exactly as before. And once that night, I hesitated. Men sat up in their beds, snatched their helmets, swords, and shields from the covers behind them, and shouting brave words that came out like squeals, they threw their legs over the sides to stumble towards me. Someone yelled, remember this hour, ye thanes of Hrothgar, the boasts you made at the mead bowl past. Remember our good king's gifts of rings, and pay him with all your might for his many kindnesses. I hurled a bench at the closest. They all cowered. I was hunched like a wrestler, moving my head from side to side. Then with a howl, one plunged at me, sword above his head in both fists. I let it come. The charm held good. I closed my hand on the blade and snatched it from the drunken thane's hand and hurled it the length of the hall. It clattered on the fireplace stones and fell to the stone floor, ringing. I seized him and crushed him. Another one came at me, gloating in his bleary-eyed heroism, maniacally joyful because he had bragged that he would die for his king, and he was doing it. He did it. Another one came, reeling and whooping, trying to make his eyes focused. I laughed. It was outrageous. So he's a gleeful villain. And Do you get the power of the language here? I mean, I I I can see some criticism of this book, but I think because it becomes sort of self-indulgent, but I actually don't think it's self-indulgent. It's self-indulgent purposefully because it's in the speaker Grendel's viewpoint, right? So Grendel is self-indulgent. That's all he is. Um, Also the charm, of course, we couldn't get through a stream without doing Macbeth because Macbeth again is in my in my opinion, Macbeth is the culmination. It is the absolute apex of all Anglo-Saxon literature because it is exactly what Beowulf comes to be in the guise of the usurping Beowulf. I mean, of the usurping Macbeth. He's a usurper king who poisons the land is poisoned. Everybody leaves Macbeth Scotland because in the exterior they feel the poison of his inside, of his motives and his megalomania. And the charm, again, right? I bear a charmed life. My favorite line from Macbeth. But remember what they say when they actually charm Macbeth and he goes through the witch's Sabbath. The final charm, right? Cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good. And then the charmed life is actually what kills him in the end, right? Let the angel who hath informed thee, let thee know. I'm paraphrasing here, but that despair thy charm. I was from my mother's womb untimely ripped, says Macduff. So his charm is over. Um, and then comes on page 83, we get Unferth. Come, come. I said, let me tell them I was sent by Sideways Walker. That's a pretty cool name. Um, he says, so you're a hero. I've never seen a live hero before. I know they were only in poetry. It must be a terrible burden, though, being a hero, glory reaper, harvester of monsters. We get these kennings and epithets again. Um, then we get, let's see, him going back to talk about the dragon. Whatever their excuse might be, I had none. I knew. I had seen the dragon, ashes to ashes, and yet I was teased, tortured by the red of her hair and the set of her chin and the white of her shoulders, teased toward disbelief in the dragon's truths. A glorious moment was coming. My chest insisted, even the fact that I myself would have no part in it. A member of the race of God, cursed, according to the Shaper's tale, was trifling to him. So it's interesting that he says ashes to ashes because the dragon, we're going to learn, lives on ashes. He lives in the Valley of Ashes. He wants to make everything into the Valley of the Jeff Stein, Effrey, Great Gatsby, Valley of Ashes, and the T.S. Eliot Wasteland, or the Jesse Weston From Ritual to Romance, Golden Bough, J.G. Frazier, Ashes to Ashes, Valley of Ashes, the nothingness, and the dragon will feed on ashes and death. Um, this says, Grendel says, I decided to kill her. I finally committed myself to killing her slowly, horribly. I would begin by holding her over the fire and cooking the ugly hole between her legs. I laughed harder at that. They were all screaming now, hooting and yawling to their dead stick gods. I would kill her. Yes, I would squeeze out her feces between my fists. So much for her meaning as the quality of life. I would kill her and teach them reality. Grendel, the truth teacher, phantasm tester. I resolved, here's his MO finally on page 110. This is where he becomes himself a sort of a dragon. He says, I resolved absolutely and finally to kill myself for love of the baby Grendel that used to be. But the next instant, for no particular reason, I changed my mind. Balance is everything. Sliding down slime, right? Since man crawled out of the slime. And Grendel literally crawls out of the slime because he lives in the fen and the bog. Luckily, Beowulf has been blessed with the ability to breathe or to hold his breath underwater, and he has a grip. He has like two superpowers. Remember, he could swim. He can hold like he can swim slash hold his breath like forever underwater. That's how he sinks down in the bog, and then gets to Grendel's mother. And he also has a grip. He has a grip on that can out it can break Grendel's grip, and Grendel has this death grip like this demonic death grip, and that's supposed to show that that Beowulf's grip is again another thing that's both figurative and literal. It's literal because he has a grip on Grendel and on evil, but it's figurative because it's going to show that he has a grip on his people and on dispassionate intensity, a display of power that they've sent heroes constantly to the Danes to helped them kill Grendel, but none have lasted because they were all too motivated. Now, Beowulf also, again, has this sort of clash of cultures because he's great at boasting. But again, this is something that we still get today. It's important for the hero now, even now in the modern day, it's important for the hero to be both humble and to be virtuous, right? To be humble and virtuous, but also to be able to boast when it's appropriate. He has to be able to tell his story to get the grip of his audience so that they will understand, follow him, and believe in him. Um, the slime is interesting because again, we just got that in the network stream. Um, since man crawled out of the slime, which is this, socio-evolutionary steering viewpoint of the political steering of a massive group of the globe, really, of all the peoples of the earth. Um, let's see. One other thing was that this book really is pure Jean-Paul Sartre in a number of ways because we see that that's the way, and I think that's probably unintentional. This is a good example of why I wouldn't ask the author what their opinion of their work because the author is almost certainly gonna say something about how, about his paradigm of life where actually when we read it, we see that it's no it's it's no accident that the bad guy speaks all of the words of Sartre, and that leads him to lose. He's a loser. Um, and one quote I get from Sartre that I always think of is, "To eat is to appropriate by destruction." So that's what Grendel is doing. He is a cannibal, and he's killing the people. He's a cannibal slash predator because he is born from man. He's born from Cain, but he becomes the ultimate apex predator version of what a human would be. In fact, he becomes almost a non-entity at times. In this, it's interesting because when when the Danes first discover him, they don't even see him. They think that he's a tree because his skin is so hard and bark-like. It looks like it's almost not alive. It looks tree-like, but a tree is alive, and Grendel is a living, breathing being. So the exterior hardness and the sort of tactile skin that he has um, becomes almost ant-like. Think token. It becomes almost ant-like, but he opens his eyes and he scares them, and then they decide to cut him down. When they first actually confront him, they think that he's a rotting tree, and they're trying to decide how best to take care of their vineyards and their arbors because they say that basically like they learned from the old folk from the old Celts and the Angles and the Saxons that how to take care of the trees because if the tree has poison, it means that something about it has offended nature. And so they have to cut it out. They have to get rid of it. Well, it's the same in this sense that he has offended God and they have to get rid of him. They have to get rid of him out of their world because he's going to become active and destroy them. The last thing I'll read from this is page 108. I might have already read this part. He says, yes, that's the part that I just read. I'd seen the dragon. Beowulf finally comes in at the very end. And another theme in this is mechanization and the mechanical. Grendel describes the world in a kind of a deistic spirit as like it's kind of like God sets the world spinning and it becomes this mechanical motion of the earth revolving around the sun, which is like deistic, right? Clockmaker. Um, but then the dragon sort of tells him in a kind of a Gnostic spirit that like everything was created falsely and that, you just have to break on through to the other side to achieve what really is. But in order to do that, you have to destroy everything. And so that's essentially what Grendel goes into. So that's I'm going to end with Grendel, and that end Grendel right there because what happens at the end of Beowulf, and it happens in this, is that Grendel doesn't get killed outright by Beowulf. In fact, it's that makes it this is the first time when I've really been able to see in terms of how we are right now, why this is relevant because the hero doesn't kill Grendel outright like he does Grendel's mother or like the dragon. He defeats the dragon in this, epic battle between good and evil. Instead, Grendel gets his arm ripped off and he runs away and cries to his mother in his basement. And his mother, being the unleashes her fury. She's been an absent mother, but she still lets him cry to her in her fen, and then she comes back and unleashes her terror in the second stage of the epic on on the Danes and the Geats. So that's Grendel. And I wonder if there's anything else in here to read about Beowulf. Um, I'll just say that on page 11 of the introduction of this great. If you haven't read Beowulf in the translation by Seamus Heaney, it's excellent. I mean, this I mentioned before when we did this stream before that this was the one text that pushed me um to go to Queen's University Belfast because I was already thinking of going there, and that's where Seamus Heaney went. I went to the Seamus Heaney School of Poetry, and he mentions how he learned at Queens, and he talks about Tolkien in this part. He says, however, when it comes to considering Beowulf as a work of literature, one publication stands out. In 1936, the Oxford scholar and teacher J.R.R. Tolkien published an epic-making paper entitled Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, which took for granted the poem's integrity and distinction as a work of art and proceeded to show in what this integrity and distinction inhered. Tolkien assumed that the poet had felt his way through the inherited material, the fabulous elements, and the traditional accounts of an heroic past, and by a combination of a creative intuition and conscious structuring, had arrived at a unity of effect and balanced order. He assumed, in other words, that the Beowulf poet was an imaginative writer rather than some kind of back formation derived from 19th century folklore and philology. Tolkien's brilliant literary treatment changed the way the poem was valued and initiated a new era and new terms of appreciation. He also goes on to say I this was brilliant. First of all, he talks about what happens in between language is what W.B. Yeats would have called a phantasmagoria, three agons, three struggles in which the preternatural force for evil of the hero's enemies comes springing at him in demonic shapes, three encounters with what the critical literature and the textbook glossaries call the monsters in three archetypal sites of fear: the barricaded night house, the infested underwater current, and the reptile haunted rocks of a wilderness. If we think of this poem in this way, its place in world art becomes clearer and more secure. Um, and then he says, we can avoid at any rate the slightly cardboard effect that the word monster tends to introduce and give the poem a fresh chance to sweep in off the moors, down through the mist bands of Anglo-Saxon England, forward into the global village of the third millennium. So we get Anglo-Saxon culture and literature sweeping into globalist millennium. He also talks about the dream element and the overall power to haunt at a certain readerly price. And one other thing that I got from this, which was really great, was what he says about poets. And he's talking about how his zest for language, especially from Beowulf, actually came from Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? You should read The Windover, right? I caught this morning's minion. Kingdom of Daylight's Dauphin, dappled dawn drawn falcon in his riding. It's a great poem. But he talks about how he says, Joseph, this is great. Totally forgotten this quote. And I probably should have remembered this quote before because this actually probably applies to everything that I've done so far on this channel or anything talking about literature. And he says, Joseph Brodsky, who was a Nobel Prize winning poet, once said that poets' biographies are present in the sounds they make. And I suppose all I'm saying is that I consider Beowulf to be part of my voice right. That's awesome. That right there shows us that we should not care about the biographies of writers and poets only in the words and the sounds that they make, and that Seamus Heaney considers Beowulf his birthright because even though Heaney is from County Londonderry, he's from near Derry in Northern Ireland, um, that the sort of ancient nature of the Ulster language inflection and vernacular gives him a provenance that allows him to look back into the past for something in the present and the future. Does that make sense? The past is prologue. In other words, Beowulf is something that is old. It's very old, but it is relevant and it's something that will work for us for the future. It provides us with a worldview and gives us a good notion of monsters. Okay, so now let's move on to what have we been going about an hour on that. So that was about an hour just on Grendel and Beowulf, and that is where we get the Anglo-Saxon dragon. Right now that again, of course, will come from the Bible. Biblical literature and text will inform our notion of the dragon itself. So, what do you guys want to do first? Should I talk about? Why don't I talk about Dragonslayer? So, Dragonslayer. Oh, by the way, please like, share, and sub. If you're watching this, you haven't said this, hit the sub button. Please hit subscribe. Please share the stream. Appreciate you. And you can support me through the links. You can super chat. Go to dono.chat. That's in the video description. You can also go to any of my links and you can support me. Really appreciate you. So let's go on to Dragonslayer. Now, this is a movie that I've thought about for like, I saw this way back in the day, and I've been thinking about going back to it for a long time. It's always one of those movies that's, like, kind of at the back of your mind, but I decided I just kept putting it off, and the main reason I put it off was because it stars Peter McNichol, and I was kinda like, I don't really care about watching a movie with this dude." But this is a great movie, you guys. This is I could not believe how good this movie was. Now, Dragon Slayer, which came out in 1981, is, um it's interesting how the movies move in these thematic sort of eons, right? And we had the sword and sandals epic that came out of Braveheart, which gave way to Gladiator and then 300 and Troy and all those movies, right? But remember that in the 70s, we we had like a bunch of movies that go into the 80s and are medieval. So I would say any movie that is, first of all, any movie filmed in Wales in the 70s and 80s, like they all look like this. This to me starts with Roman Polanski's Macbeth. It has this look, it has this aesthetic. The song remains the same. Led Zeppelin with Robert Plant's fantasy sequence, right? In the Rain song. Um, is the same thing. Then we get Dragon Slayer, and we get a whole bunch, Beastmaster. We get a whole bunch of these movies. Beastmaster wasn't filmed in Wales, but it's still sort of like this. Also, keep in mind that we're covering a dragon movie, Excalibur, Borman's Excalibur, excellent. We get we're getting a 70s dragon movie, an 80s dragon movie, and a 90s dragon movie, right? Or no, I'm sorry, 80s, 90s, 2000s. 80s is Dragon Slayer, 90s is Dragonheart, and then 2000s is Reign of Fire. So what happens in this is we start off with a castle and we've got a wizard or a sorcerer played by Ralph Richardson, who by the way is like excellent. Ralph Richardson is such a great actor. This guy, I mean, this to me is like what Alec Guinness wished that he could have done with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now I'm not knocking Obi-Wan Kenobi and Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan, but I can just imagine from the actor standpoint, from the classical actor standpoint, coming out of the old Vic, and we have John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier and Alec Guinness and Ralph Richardson. And Ralph Richardson is interesting because he was an eccentric figure, and I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Ralph Richardson personally knew Aleister Crowley because when I watched this movie, all of the trappings of the sorcerer character were Crowleyan. And in fact, the way that his face looks is he looks almost exactly like Crowley. And of course, because he's playing the sorcerer. So what happens is like he's in this castle and he's an old sorcerer and he's an alchemist and he's got a sorcerer's apprentice who is Peter McNichol. We get a group of villager townsfolk who have come and they want to talk to the sorcerer because they got to get rid of this dragon. Well, they're told, you can't come in, he can't see you because of course, there's the old porter, right? The porter is at the door because he's the porter and he won't let them into the castle. And then they tell Peter McNichol, and then finally he goes up. And what we see Ralph Richardson do is he's making some sort of spell, and he looks into his John D. Cauldron, and we hear sounds of people screaming from hell, and we see flames. And Ralph Richardson is looking into this cauldron, and he's transfixed by it, and then he's comatose. And so the guy has to, the kid has to come up and wake him up, and then he says basically, "Let him in, I'll see him," because he never sees anybody. But we learned that he did this um, because he knows that he's going to face his own death. Now, what he tells the townspeople is he says, "No," they say, "Are you afraid to face the dragon?" And he says, "No, I'm not afraid. In fact, without sorcerers, there would be no dragon." Interesting, because we have this occult alchemist who is clearly identifying with the dragon. And in fact, one of the tropes that we get in dragon movies is often that a a dragon and a man have a kind of a coexistence, a one man. And it's like as if a sorcerer has exorcised the demon. He has exorcised a dragon or brought the dragon forth from hell. In other words, he has prayed to the pandemonium and unleashed Satan into the world. And this becomes a sort of Fisher King theme in the movie where the dragon demands virgin sacrifice in order to keep the land plentiful. So, what we learn is that um, as they go on in their voyage, we learned that there's a Gumby soy. There's a Gumby soy king who is like, no, well, the dragon is my friend, and I don't want. He's like, this guy is just totally gub gub, and and we've learned that there's a lottery. There's a Shirley Jackson lottery where they do a Hunger Games every year and they put everybody's name into a lottery and they choose who's going to be the victim. And then he has been putting his daughter's name into this lottery, but actually the elites um pay him enough money to keep their daughters out of the lottery. So his daughter has actually never been in it. So later on, Peter McNichol, the sorcerer's apprentice, will be he's wearing a talisman and he will take he'll be the Gumby King will take the talisman from him and will lock him up in the bowels of this castle keep. Remember, we just did the analysis of the keep. And he's gonna tell the girl when she goes down there, look, you you've never been in this lottery. And she's like, yes, I have, and my father's a great king. And he's like, that's not true. And it's pretty cool because he's like, you haven't been in the lottery and that's not true, and that's the reason you're not in it, and everybody's paying your dad because your dad's a gub gub. And it's pretty cool in the movie because she immediately is like, actually, I think you're right. So then she goes to her dad and she's like, I'm gonna be in the lottery. So then she gets the wizard, he eventually gets his talisman back, and the talisman is like a dragon's heart. And the the wizard or the sorcerer will change all of the names in the batch to her name. So he draws her name and he's like, "No, there's been a mistake. We can't have my daughter in this." Right? And she's like, "No, father. It's actually my name is all of the names in the lottery." And he's like, "Cancel it. This thing is rigged." Interesting, right? That the lottery is rigged. So she says, "No, I'm gonna be the sacrifice." So she goes and she sacrifices herself for the people, but Peter McNichol has to go and he has to fight the dragon. He does that by making a dragon lance that he sort of hammers away at like Ahab does in Moby Dick. The reason they do this is because the sorcerer was about to go on the journey. He was gonna take this, but at the last minute, one of the townspeople was like, "We demand a test. We demand a test of, skill from the magician." Now, obviously, the magician, we get this in Exodus. The magicians always want a test of skill, right? They want to put you to the test. So the Aleister Crowley, Ralph Richardson sorcerer says, "Go upstairs and get the dagon out of the iron, the dagger out of the iron chest. Bring it down." And Peter McNichol says, "What, this one?" And he says, "Let it fall." And then the thing flies towards him. And then he tells this knight, or this murdering oafish knight, like, take this dagger and strike me down. I'm protected." But he knows actually that he is just siding himself. And so when he does that, he kills himself, right? So the sorcerer dies, and that will make way for the sorcerer's apprentice to take over his birthright, which is to become the next sorcerer. But as we'll see in the movie, sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi style, he will come back in the guise of a white wizard, which is actually just a guy with OTO regalia, who joins with he sort of joins at one with the dragon, and he tells the sorcerer's apprentice, "At the moment when I hitch a ride on this dragon, smash the talisman with a stone, just like Grendel smashes the ram, with a skull-sized stone, smashes his skull, and that will obliterate the dragon and the sorcerer." So again, the two are united in one, and it's interesting also the ram, because remember when we were doing the stream on Raiders of the Lost Ark with David Patrick Harry. Shouts out to David Patrick Harry, because he's making his way back here. I can't wait to hear what his great life's journey and adventure of A Church of the Eternal Logos. Remember when we did that stream? At the end of it, when they're about to open the ark, we have the guy in the OTO costume with the ram's head shield right on his chest, and that's sort of what Ralph Richardson is doing here, and what Grendel was talking about in in the book Grendel, which is kind of a quasi Old Testament priest's garb, but in this it's supposed to be um esoteric and almost it's more Egyptian and occult. And then the again, the talisman is like the dragon's heart, and that is mixed in terms of their destinies and their fates, because these guys are all about fate, with the sorcerer. So then the young sorcerer will ascend to his birthright. And that is what happens in the book. They rescue the princess, and they live happily ever after. One of the other themes in this, though, which is interesting, is that I noticed that this movie, Dragonslayer, has a kind of a reverse Skittles theme. And I can't really get too much into it to describe it, but what I mean is that this is the opposite of what you get now, where let's say people realize, let's say that nowadays people realize who they are, or who they think they are, right? And they take on certain characteristics. Let's say that. Well, in the 80s, we get this thing that we also get in As You Like It by Shakespeare, which is where people have to hide their identity by dressing up one way, and then later reveal who they truly are in their identity by going back to what they actually are. So do you see how it's kind of a reverse? So in this, we get the tomboy character of this girl she's actually when you see her, you're like, this is going to be the love interest, isn't it? And this happened all in the 70s and 80s, especially with like fantasy adventure movies. And she's hiding her identity because of the lottery. The lottery is going to kill all the firstborn girls. So do you see how it's kind of reversed? And so she has to he actually finds out that she is actually who she is, because he goes to a kind of Narcissus echo pond, where he sees that she is the Venus character bathing, and that when they bathe, he has this kind of proto baptism where he comes out and she is actually reveals her true self. Right, does that make sense? So I realized that about 70s and 80s movies, because Um, it's interesting that the epic a lot of these epics, especially involving dragons, are actually not about the dragon, but about the people and the people finding out who they are in the face of danger. Now, a lot of this is like you saw in Grendel was facing the abyss, right? You stare back into the abyss and then you realize who you are and the whole Sartre thing. We also get that from Milton, where Satan has to cross the abyss or Aleister Crowley has to cross the abyss and Charon's on to get to his true villainy. But this is yeah. Chris is listening to me at 2x for a while. My voice probably sounds so fast and so pitched up. So thank you for being here, Crystal, and I appreciate you. Um, but that's the movie Dragon Slayer. And again, this is a great movie. The dragon in this movie is called oh, what's the name of the dragon? The dragon, I know that the dragon in Dragon Slayer took gave inspiration to George R. R. Martin. Um, because he said it was the most realistic dragon that he'd seen in a movie, and we actually do see this particular dragon taken almost wholesale into other movies. So we get this in Dragonheart is different because it's a CGI dragon, but we get this with Peter Jackson's SMAUG. We get this SMAUG, uh, which by the way, the name is like the lizard demon who hides in holes, right? We also get the obviously the smog dragon is supposed to be directly from Beowulf because we just talked about how Seamus Heaney um was citing that essay written by Tolkien, and that essay actually is the one that got to Beowulf reintroduced back into popular lore, culture, the literary canon, and the education system because Beowulf was passed aside for many years. But especially the inspiration for the dragon sitting on gold. Let me read you the one part the dragon says at the end of his Sardian existential monologue. Um, because that's pretty interesting. And yes, he says, "Spare me, I beg you." He covered his ears with his claws, gave a hideous grin, but I was stubborn. He said that the greatest of gods made the world, every wonder bright plain and the turning seas. He said, ridiculous, because he's a Lucifer demon. Why? What God? Where? Life force, you mean? The principle of process? God is the history of chance. Do you get it? How this is a nihilistic, existential, chance driven um fakery driven by a Lucifer inverted demon. He says, in the same way I couldn't explain, I knew that his scorn of my childish credulity was right. Nevertheless, something will come of all this. I said, nothing, he said, a brief pulsation in the black hole of eternity. My advice to you, wait and see, I said. He shook his head. My advice to you, my violent friend, is to seek out gold and sit on it. So who knew that the dragon in Grendel was Ron Paul, um, G. Gordon Liddy, Roslyn Capital. Gold. Seek out gold. No, I mean I'm being facetious, but in other words, live by live by the senses, sit on the valuable tactile concrete things, and hoard gold. Do you see how the this is also the paganism versus Christianity and the clash of these cultures and movements, great sweeping movements of history. Yeah, the dragon in Dragon Slayer is called Vermithrax pejorative, which means basically, um, hold on, Vermithrax. Thrax is Thracian, so it's the let's see. It says translated from Latin, it means the worm of Thrace that makes things worse, which is a pretty a Beowulf poet name, but also it's the the worm, right? The worm is something that it's a serpentine worm. It's supposed to be a reptilian serpentine worm, but it's also the kind of worm of doubt. So again, the outer context is supposed to be a symbol of what is the inner faith doubt and crisis of faith and existence that is the sort of driving force of all of these epics. And so moving on to it's a great name though, Vermithrax pejorative. Kind of like there's an Icelandic saga where it's the um remember what's Gandalf's horse's name? Shadowfax. Fax, Fax means horse in Anglo-Saxon or Icelandic, and that's from Fryfaxi, the Icelandic one of the characters in one of the Icelandic sagas. So so moving on to what's the next movie we got? Dragonheart. Now this movie is interesting because it's it's Dennis Quaid and Sean Connery. It's Sean Connery as the dragon, Draco. Part of the theme of the movie is that the dragon cannot doesn't have a name. He gets increasingly upset as time goes on because he doesn't have a name, he doesn't have an identity, and finally he is identified according to the constellation Draco. So he says basically, so my name is just a translation of my name in another language, which is not having a name. And he says, yes, but I thought it was good. And he says, no, you know what? I like it. And so that's again the dragon in this represents like the dragons are the watchers. But what happens in this is basically that we have Dennis Quaid and a he is the one who is he's kind of like Achilles training Patroclus in the Iliad. So he is a knight training this younger guy, but it's different in this because what happens is we always have to take into account the dragon in terms of Anglo-Saxon literature when we talk about Uther Pendragon, right? Because Arthur is the knight who is the son of Uther Pendragon, and Uther Pendragon, um, what happens with Uther Pen? It's different in some of the other. I have all of the Arthurian text over here. I've got Gretchen de Troyes and we've got all the Gawain texts or Gowan texts. I've got Wolfram von Eschenbach. I've got all of them over there, and they're all sort of slightly different. But one of the things that happens is Uther Pendragon is this great king, and someone comes in as a shapeshifter and takes his place and has sex with his wife. That leads to um, he ends up dying. There's a dragon. Arthur's born. There's a dragon, and there's a drag that Merlin keeps the dragon under the castle, and that eventually this is going to arise. This will kind of play a part later on in the myth of Arthur later on um because the great like mythical saying about when the ravens return to the castle that Arthur will return. Arthur, of course, and is supposed to not die. He's supposed to be taken off in the barge to Avalon, but I always kind of think that Merlin is supposed to be taken from St. Patrick, and one of the reasons I think that is because Merlin but it becomes this sort of folkloric, wizard vision of a misunderstanding of St. Patrick's miracles, because St. Patrick existed in the 5th century, and that's kind of the basis for Arthur. I mean, I know Arthur goes back to pre-British, proto-Romantic, proto-Roman and Celtic times, and that there have been a number of Arthurs, but the Arthur, and especially in terms of Gretchen de Troyes, is supposed to be exist around the 5th century, and so I just always think that there's a weird correlation between St. Patrick and Merlin. I've got St. Patrick's epic over there. There's actually an epic poem about St. Patrick, but but one of the things that happens is that the dragon plays a sort of background for this, and then of course later on Mordred will be a kind of dragon because Mordred or Death and the son of Morgan Le Fay will be the bastard child of Arthur and that will kill him with the lance. The lance ties in with the Fisher King and the Lance of Longinus and restoring the kingdom to wholeness. We talked about the exterior versus the interior, the macrocosmic and the microcosmic. But anyway, so what happens in this is that um Dennis Quaid, who has an atrocious accent in this movie, um, he is he's got like kind of an Irish accent, but it's not an Irish accent. And the movie was filmed in Slovakia, and I guess it's supposed to be just some sort of non-American, generalized medieval European accent. But he's training this again, this real Gumby Edward II character, Gub Gub Kid, and the kid gets killed and he takes a drag half of there's a dragon and the dragon gives half his heart to this prince who then becomes like the king. And then Dennis Quaid thinks that he's been bewitched because when he comes back, when he comes back to life, when he's reborn bad. And he wants to rebuild his kingdom, but with the use of slave labor. And he's like whipping all the townspeople, all the serfs. All they want to do is just stand around and stack mud all day, right? But David Thewlis, right? I can't do a David Thewlis. I've wanted. Yeah. How does David Thewlis talk? He's got a Northern English accent, but I can't do a specifically David Thewlis accent. But anyway, he wants to make slaves of all these people, right? And so then um Dennis Quaid's like, I'm getting out of here. So he becomes a sort of a knight errant or kind of a Ronin because he has no master. And then he becomes a kind of a con man, but he's supposed to live by this code. And he tells his young trainee foundling, bad Arthur, live by the code. And then, and David Thewlis is like, right, I'll free this woman. And then, he's going to free this man whom he's about to blind. And then he ends up shooting him in the heart with an arrow. And Dennis Quaid he pieces out. But he ends up finding this dragon who is Sean Connery, a CGI dragon, and they fight with each other, and they have this sort of epic fight, and then it becomes a stalemate, and they learn they have to help each other. So it's kind of a children's movie, but what's interesting is that it becomes this farcical comedy where they end up. It's funny and innocent and sort of wholesome because the dragon is going to terrorize a village. But Dennis Quaid arrives as the Dragonslayer and he shoots an arrow and he kills the dragon and the people pay him. But actually, he catches the arrow and he fakes his death and then they move on to another village. But eventually, Sean Connery's Draco tells him, look, this is great and all, but you're not really living by that code you were talking about. And he's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, you know, it's the elites that you actually should be stealing from, like, in terms of you should be Robin Hooding, from the elites and giving to these poor people. Instead, you're just still robbing the poor people. So even though you're robbing less than the elites are, you're still robbing them. So Dennis Quaid, he's like, "Oh, yeah, it's kinda true." They get kinda caught in their con. Eventually, they they fight, David Thewlis, and then it becomes another stalemate where in order to kill David Thewlis, he's invincible because he has this dragon's heart, and so he has to kill Draco. So Draco demands, because he gets chained by David Thewlis, but then he demands that he S-side himself, or he gets S-sided by Dennis Quaid. Dennis Quaid throws this axe at his heart. He dies. David Thewlis dies. But then Draco the dragon gets to ascend to the Great White Way and the Blavatsky Masters, and the Watchers, and he goes up into the constellation. The constellation Draco goes, and all the dragons in the constellation form into one ball. They explode into this cosmic Neil deGrasse Tyson light. And then he's up there as a constellation. We learn, oh, we can always look up to the stars, and see what the dragons gave us because the dragons were actually the protectors of men, not the destroyers. So it's it is what it is, but it's actually a pretty decent movie. It's pretty watchable. It's just a different take on a dragon, and it is fun. You know, if you were a kid watching this in 1996, you might think it was fun. I was 16 in 1996, and I had no interest in watching this movie. I was watching I was watching I don't know, Menace to Society in 1996. Yo, you got some snaps on the petrol? Break yourself, right? But, yeah, so I kind of avoided this one, even though I've always liked this kind of movie, but so that's another take on that. So, now let's move on to the 2000s dragon, um, and we could talk about Red Dragon, which has, Ray Fiennes, but that probably is the best, current iteration of what the dragon means, because in that Francis Dollarhide literally consumes he goes to the Brooklyn Museum where they have it on display. He asks for it. He finds the artwork for Blake's red dragon, which he's obsessed with. He's got a red dragon tattoo on his back. He becomes the beast. He consumes the beast, and then he goes off on his killing spree, and he tries to kill Edward Norton's son with a mirror shard because he's got a shattered psyche. And your son is changing. You see, your son is changing. He is in the process. He is in the process of becoming, he says, which is kind of the inspiration for one of the inspirations for my own novel that I'm writing with the Mirror Man, Mirror Shard Killer, and the Shattered Psyche. But that's through MK Ultra. But but that's a different story, and that kind of takes on its own life. So let's talk about the movie Reign of Fire. Reign of Fire came out in 2002. I saw this one in the theater. This is a really good movie. I like this movie a lot, mainly because it's it's got three of the great actors, the three sort of alpha actors or sigma actors actually of well, it's got Christian Bale, who's, not really in sigma mode here. This is post American Psycho and pre um Batman Begins, and he is playing the virtuous protagonist. Now, one thing about this is that um Mixie said Spawn is my favorite movie. um actually, admission here, I've never seen Spawn. I never watched it because it was on HBO at the time when I was 16 or 17 all the time. And I saw it coming on so many times, and it just did not appeal to me. I did not want to watch it. So you might be mad at that, but I've never seen Spawn. It's like it's that I've never seen Spawn, and I've never watched what's another movie I've never seen that I should have seen? I've never watched Casablanca. Can you believe that? Of all the movies, I've seen like every other movie, but I've never watched Casablanca, and I've never watched Spawn. Yes, post Newsies. Um, so so uh so he is the virtuous protagonist, and he lives in a castle keep where he takes ownership of this group of post-apocalyptic English people in Northumberland. The movie is set in 2020. This is interesting because the world, get this now. Okay. So the movie starts off in the 90s, and Christian Bale is a kid, and he's in London, and he's going to see his mom. He's got he's got a single mother, because he mentions his dad, and he says, "Maybe dad can help me pay for this scholarship." And she's like, looks at him, and he's like, "No, dad's gone. He went off to the garage, and he never returned." And so he's got the single mother. She is a kind of a girl boss, but she works in the mines. For some reason they're like mining underneath London. Um, which they do, I guess, occasionally from time to time. Remember when they found the burial place of Richard III, like, underneath a car park, right? Because remember Richard that we covered Richard III. Richard III died at the Battle of Bosworth, and he was the last English king to die in battle, right? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Then let's to it pell mell, if not to heaven, then hand in hand to hell, says Shakespeare. Well, they found Richard III. Well, they do this occasionally, but this one's like way underneath. And there's a bunch of working class men down there. Right, Quinn. Right, you gonna have a smoke? Not today, mate. Not unless I'm drinking. That's what he says. So he's got, he's a self-assured kid. But he gets down to the bowels and he sees his mom and he tells her he's lost his scholarship for his school. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and says they found a void. Now there's a void in the mine, but we know that the void is going to be a kind of a metaphysical void. It's a blackness in one of the holes. So he gets Quinn, who's down in the bowels of this place, not wearing a hard hat, sends him in to go take a look at it. I mean, that's all right, right? He's just he give this kid some backbone. He goes into this hole, and he sees again the glittering gold, shimmering walls of this what looks almost like an ancient Anglo-Saxon gold hoard. But instead, it turns out to be a dragon because the floor sets on fire in a kind of blue mystical haze. And then we see the dragon come alive. He rises up out of the darkness with his mother, but his mother gets killed. She sacrifices herself for him. And then we see it is now present day. Get this. Okay. Present day is 2020. And guess what's happened to the world? It's all burning. You didn't know this movie was going to be revelatory like that, did you? Right? Predictive and revelatory. So we see a montage of headlines. For some reason, there's newspaper headlines, even though the world's burned. And we see that um, London, Paris, New York, everywhere has burned. The world has burned. And these people have made their way to a castle keep in Northumberland. Now, in the castle keep, Quinn is there with his best friend, Gerry Butler. Things are about to get sporty. And so it's good natured Gerry Butler out there with Quinn. And we see that there are a couple of fellas, they want to make their way out of the encampment, out of the compound, because they're going to go hungry. And Christian Bale, who speaks the whole time in his Terminator Salvation voice, which is, you can't go out there. No, you can't go out there. Oh, if you get out, we're going to dig. We're going to dig. That's what we do. Listen, what do we do when the dragons come? We're going to dig. And if not, then we run away. That's what we do. And the guy says, listen, fucker, we've been here a long time. It's great that we have hope, but we can't feed our children on hope. So is that also supposed to be predictive? Because it's 2002, it's before 2008. But he's saying we can't feed our kids on hope. We got to get some tomatoes out there. There's a whole field of tomatoes, right? Because the tomatoes are going to grow out there in the midst of the ash, and they're going to keep growing. It's apocalypse food. Well, Gerry Butler comes in and says, right, listen, what does he say? He says, things are about to get sporty. Listen, you can't go out there. Now, how's he talk? I don't know how's he talking in this movie, but he basically says, you can't go out there, man. If you go out there with yourself and your little band of mini marauders and your kids and you want to go get the tomatoes, that's fine. But you're not going to be let back into the compound. And the guy's like, damn it. Right. So, well, anyway, so what happens is the guy goes out anyway, and they're grabbing all the tomatoes they can. They're eating these tomatoes. And then Christian Bale shows up in his diesel machines and he actually saves them. Right. Um, well, when that happens, the dragon comes and nukes their vehicles or whatever, but they get away, they get back to the castle keep. Now, when they're in the castle keep, this is pretty cool because they've got everything they need here. First of all, they've got one dude who's manning the radios. This guy's a live streamer. He's sitting down there, he's streaming. They got another guy. He's the guy that you see in all the movies. He's like the bald guy who's in Mandy, and he's up there. He's the falconer. He's the falcon. The falcon cannot reach the falconer, and he's looking out for the dragons. They got a bunch of ladies down there. They've even got the old chapel from the ancient castle keep, and they're doing a kind of post-apocalyptic passion play in this. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's a bunch of school kids and they're getting their nighttime story before they go to bed. And Christian Bale and Gerry Butler are reenacting the scene from Empire Strikes Back, the famous scene. So Christian Bale is Darth Vader, and the other guy's Luke, and they reenact the scene, which is interesting because this is showing you they've got the painted walls and the icons of the chapel behind them, and they're doing this passion play in this, and this is showing you that, like, in the landscape of post modernity and the burning world, that their new religion is going to be the religion is kind of the religion of pop culture and the self. And so they even do this thing where they say, "All right, before we go to bed, we gotta say our prayers," but they don't say a prayer. They actually don't pray. They get in the motion of praying, and then they recite their mantra for how to survive the dragon attack, which is, "If the dragon comes, run away!" Right? It's pretty funny. Um, if it weren't so, so twisted. But the best part in the movie comes when they're outside and all of a sudden, um, uh, what's worse than the dragon showing up to the castle keep? There's only one thing worse than the satanic dragon coming: Americans, right? So they see Blackwater coming over the hills, and there's a bunch of diesel trucks and armored personnel carriers, and on top we've got the post-apocalyptic dystopian marauder of the wastelands of all alpha of all time, Matthew McConaughey. And this is probably my favorite role of McConaughey's, like, and if aside from like True Detective, in the funny roles. I mean, this is probably his most like badass role because he like he really does look the part. I mean, he's sitting on top of this tank and he's got this great he's like he comes in and he's like, "I'm the alpha." And he's got this big cannon howitzer phallic symbol that he's riding on. And he's got his arms with these serpentine, dragon-like tattoos. He's totally bald. He's got this beard. He's chewing on a cigar, Patton style, and he's got like this sleeveless leather bomber jacket with an American flag on his heart. And you're like, "What?" So he shows up and he says that, basically his name is Van Zant. Zant is it's interesting because in the scene where he gains Christian Bale's trust, he hands him a dragon's tooth, and Zant is the tooth. It's also hewn out of rock, and he looks hewn out of rock. He looks huge in this. He looks like he's 4 times bigger than Christian Bale, which is pretty cool. And he says basically, we can't we're part of we're the Kentucky we're the y'all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Y'all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. He says, "We're the Kentucky Irregular. Let me tell you a little story, boys." I took this from Jack. "Let me tell you a little story, boys. When I was a boy, my daddy was a dungeon master for the whole town. He had a pair of 50-sided dice. We're the Kentucky Irregulars. Dragons swept over us. Many men were killed. And I managed to shoot that old dragon down out of the sky." So he shot a dragon down out of the sky. He's a dragon slayer. And he says, "Look, man, we flew over here 8,000 miles. We landed on Airstrip 1 and we just need a place to fuel up our diesel." So he gains his way into the keep. Well, Gerry Butler says, "Things are about to get sporty. How the fuck can you believe this fella? Oh, he's a dragon slayer now." Right? He doesn't believe him at all. Well, it turns out that Matthew McConaughey is a dragon slayer, and they've killed 200 dragons. They killed him when the dragons came over from Kentucky, and they had a damn epidemiologist or whatever trace the skin of the dragon back to its origin, which is in England. So what we find out is that all the dragons that they've killed, they're all female dragons. Now, this is kind of cool because it's the opposite of the usual monster movie where we get all the monsters are male and they're serving the Black Widow female. They're all serving the alpha male dragon, which is the Satan dragon that's been buried underground. And in this story, we learned that the dragons have existed since prehistoric time, and killed all of the plastic dinosaurs in the Dinobot age. And then they ran out of food to eat, and now they've been hibernating. This one dragon has been hibernating, and until it was awoken by Quinn, right? In the bowels of London. So, in other words, we also get the story of, you know, there is a great Anglo-American alliance that is formed out of Imperial England, but then spawns an elite group of an elite roundtable group in terms of the globe, and the roundtable group is going to take over the world and see the world burn in 2020. And so it's up to the townspeople and the regular people to go and get rid of it so that they can have order out of chaos. Do you see? It's like a whole hodgepodge of stuff in terms of the in terms of a sort of pre Great Reset era epic. But Matthew McConaughey does indeed kill one of he kills this female dragon. They get this dragon's egg out of it, and it's pretty cool how they do it because the aesthetic of the movie looks a lot like Terminator Salvation. It's like gray, it's gray and ashen. And that is because we learned that the dragons, just like we learned in Grendel and in Beowulf, the dragon survives on ash and death and wants to make a wasteland of the world, right? Until it will hibernate for until a new Yeatsian Golden Dawn eon. Right. Or the turning and turning, the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, right? Remember in this poem, The Second Coming? So, um, what does McConaughey say? He says, magic hour. He says, magic hour. And there's this great scene where they kill the dragon because they have a helicopter. A black helicopter shows up, and it's piloted by the hot girl from Goldeneye, who's I think the hottest Bond girl. Just throwing that out there. Isabella, whatever her name is, she's the Bond girl, and she's piloting the helicopter, of course. And they get these three kamikaze dudes, and the way they kill the dragon is they jump out of the helicopter and they kamikaze through the air in flight suits. They're like bait for the dragon. They set up a triangulation system on the ground. One of the guys, they do like a blitzkrieg on the dragon because they have light motorcycle forces, they have aerial forces, and then they bring in the ground forces last. But the guy on the motorcycle gets blitzed by the dragon, and so then the knight Christian Bale has to come out of the castle. He comes back out on horseback, and he takes over the triangulation system. That helps them to set up the great dragon lance that McConaughey is going to use to shoot at the dragon and shoot it in the heart and kill it. And then they get this dragon tooth. Then they have a Matrix Revolution style cave party inside the keep, complete with liquor, and all the women are there and everything, and they're having a good time. Bonfires. They're eating slabs of dragon beef. And then McConaughey comes in and he says, "You all are having a good time in here. What about all my men that are dead? You think this is a good time, but this is life and death, light and shadow." Right. So they have to kill this dragon. And then he decides to press the men of the keep into service. And when he does this, Bateman is pissed. Christian Bale comes out of the castle and he slugs McConaughey in the face. Now, this is a great fight because he slugs him in the face, and McConaughey does this thing where, like, he takes off his jacket and he's like, "Come on!" And he's like, when he punches Christian Bale. I'm sorry to nerd out over this, but it's pretty funny watching it. He's like huge. They made him look huge. He is a beast, man. And I've never seen anybody punch like this. He's got his arms out like with his open hands, and when he punches him, he goes, "Ah!" And you're like, he gets on top of him and he's punching him, making these dragon noises. So I know that that's a choice by the artistic director of the film, that McConaughey takes on the characteristics of the thing that he's fighting, because he's got, again, this serpentine um, sort of dragon-esque tattoo lines over his body and his biceps, and he looks like a wizard mage fighting Christian Bale. But of course, this is a fight between the alphas because at the beginning when they met, Christian Bale said, he said, "What's your deal?" And McConaughey said, "I lead, you follow." And then after the fight, and one of the guys gets killed, and Christian Bale proves himself to be the hero who was correct in his assessment of the dragons, because he also, like, he has firsthand knowledge of this. McConaughey says, "You were right. We're going to go to London. You lead, I follow." So now the roles have been reversed. So three characters again. Remember how we were talking about how we get the dragon, Grendel, and Grendel's mother? Well, in this we get Matthew McConaughey, the dragon, a kind of an equal but a kind of a son figure in this, which is Christian Bale, and we get a Sophia character who is the Bond woman, decide to set off themselves to London, and they're going to seek out the Alpha Dragon. And they need Christian Bale because he knows where the dragon lives underground. Well, they seek it out, and it's pretty cool because London's burning. It's surrounded by dragons, and they got to get down there. And then finally, McConaughey sacrifices himself. And there's a great scene. It's pretty cool because McConaughey like flies across this chasm, like from a spire to the dragon, like with a medieval battle axe, and kills he's the Dragonslayer, but he sacrifices himself. And then in the end, we get the woman and Christian Bale make a new life on the heath, and there's no more dragons. So we get the post-apocalyptic dystopian wasteland marauder goes good and saves his people. Of course, he saves his people with a fake prayer, right? Which is I hate that part of the movie. I wish that they hadn't I wish that when they were in the very chapel, I wish they just prayed. But we can see that in a way that this mimics Beowulf because again, McConaughey, even though he looks like the future alpha like of the Ashland, he actually in another world would look like an Anglo-Saxon warrior. I mean, he does. He carries a battle axe. He carries a battle axe. He's a dragon slayer. He collects dragon teeth. He eats dragons. He has a whole band of followers after him, just like Beowulf. They all go to slay this dragon, and so he's supposed to be the Viking character. Um, and so I mean, even the way that they speak in this is very much like they don't really have an economy of language, but the way that they speak in their worldview is sort of tempered by, again, a clash of cultures. And of course, in this, it's from the old world to the new, and then the new world becomes the new world where they have to start over again, order out of chaos again. And get out of here, bug. And so, yeah, he's just like a Norse hero, and he saves his people and he starts over again on the heath. But it's a very folkish tale. Yes, he becomes a kind of Viking berserker. And again, just like Beowulf, he comes from the outside. He comes from across the sea, just like the Geats. And he saves this group of Danes, who are the Angles and the Saxons in Northumbria. And they go to city, they go and they kill this dragon beast, and then it's over. So again, I think that that's a I think that's a fairly I don't know, we've now done a one assessment of one area of dragons in literature and film, and I think that there's so much more you could talk about with dragons. When we could talk about St. George and the dragon, and there are so many areas of dragons we can talk about, and Draco and the reptilians and the Asiatic dragons. We could talk about there. Those aren't my areas. I just think that the way that we look at this is important in terms of when we're looking at literature for the Western canon and what the dragon represents. Again, the dragon is supposed to literally be Satan, right? The great is supposed to be the great dragon from the abyss, from the depths, who's come to make war on creation. And I think all of these movies do a fairly good, like, they provide fairly good examples of what that means. And one thing that is often overlooked in these is the fact that the dragon when the dragon speaks, it is seductive and has a command of language, like in Token, right? Like in Desolation of Smaug. Um, it's also, I mean, that occurs in a sort of a lighter version in Dragonheart, right? Which is a sort of a fantastical version of this. The rest of them are phantasmagorical and are supposed to also be um the apex of what the predator represents in terms of the destruction of future culture and the movement of a people forward. And so the dragon is essential to an understanding of Anglo-Saxon literature, culture, and history, and that is essential for understanding where we are now and our paradigm and our worldview, and for understanding why the dragon and why evil as a chosen shadow of pride exists out of the light of God, and how it's up to people to make choices in terms of their free will. This gets sort of clouded and confused in the movie, I mean, in the book Grendel by John Gardner, but he does a good job of taking on a postmodern viewpoint of it, which is just another iteration of this, right? The postmodern existentialist view of nothingness, as opposed to the active, creative, God-given forces of the protagonist. So that's Grendel. That's Beowulf, Seamus Heaney's translation. Um, if you want to see more of Beowulf, a more in-depth analysis of just Beowulf, please go and look at that early Anglo-Saxon literature and Beowulf analysis that I did way back. I know the when you go back and look at that, like the audio is, I was using a hotspot on my phone for the analysis, but that was early on in the life of the channel, and so we've moved on from there. So thank you for being here for that, you guys. Let's look and see if we got any super chats. Let's see. Let's check it out. And then just to finish up, after I do that, I will probably talk about just briefly about what I got for the future and other books and movies that I've been checking out recently. Um, so let's see. So we got Saint Protos sends 22 CAD, 22, what's that? Canadian bucks, and says, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Absolutely love the work you do. I'm binge watching all your content. God bless. Thank you, St. Protos. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Um, Roscoe Pico Train, Roscoe P. Coltrane says, have you ever heard Roscoe P. Coltrane, the rapper on the early NERD? He was on the Star Trek collection and on NERD's In Search of album. Roscoe Pico Train sends 30, I think that's Canadian bucks, and says, this is definitely based. Big ups. Well, thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. That is very kind of you. Let's see if we got anything. I don't know if we got anything in the donut chat. Um, don't forget about the donut chat, guys. We got to use that. And that's easy to get to and easy to drop those. So if you want to do that, really appreciate that. Thanks to everybody in the chat. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Let's see. Shouts out to our homeboy Thomas Henderson, our good friend here who sends 20 bucks. And thank you so much, Thomas Henderson. You are the best. Really appreciate you. Let's see. Shouts out to Jason, dropped some bucks over the last week. Shouts out to Gabriel, who dropped 10 bucks. And says, your content is helping my own project. Great work. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Really appreciate you. Let's see. Let's check on the other ones. I got to check on my phone for some of these when I look at them, because I'm afraid if I check these particular ones on the computer, I will hit a button and mess the whole thing up. Boomer teching in here big time. So again, yes, again, let's see. Shouts out to Amy, who drops $5 on PayPal. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And again, thank you to Jason, who drops $10 on PayPal. Awesome. And again to Thomas Henderson, thanks again for the super chats, you guys. Really appreciate you guys. Um, no, I know I actually I mean, those other ones get to me right away. Yes, Jason, thank you so much for dropping that on PayPal. Really appreciate you because gets to me right away. But anything you guys want to use, really appreciate you. If you want to drop, you can drop. You can support me on those 3 links anytime during the week. You can also drop dono chats, and then you can do super chats here. We don't have memberships yet because I've been wondering about like what you guys would want for memberships. Or what I could offer because I don't want to offer memberships if like I don't have anything substantial to give you in return. So you can drop me some ideas. You can email me at madmaximalism@gmail.com with 2 X's. You can drop me comments below the video afterwards, or just leave comments on the videos, and I'll see them. Really appreciate you if you wanna like and share the stream or support me in any way, you can always do that anytime. So coming up, um, what do we have? We have some sponsored streams coming up. You can support me on PayPal, Cash App, Venmo. Support me and drop me $100. Get me to do those. I've also got movie analyses coming up. I've got coming up in the works. We're gonna go back to 19th century literature and talk about Charles Dickens and Great Expectations, the novel, and then also the new series that's out. We've got Dostoevsky coming up. We've got Decameron, um, something on Ben Franklin. I'm gonna do the Scarlet Letter, again, 19th century. Probably some more Herman Melville. We've got I'm thinking about doing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne, and what else? The big one that I want to do soon will be a Robert Redford CIA trilogy. So we'll do Sneakers, 3 Days of the Condor, and what's the other one? There's another Robert Redford movie I want to do. I can't think of it right now. Um, Spy Game. The one with Brad Pitt. We'll do that film. So we'll do that as a trilogy, but I'll also, as part of that, because we're a literature channel, cover the Grady book, 6 Days of the Condor. So I'm just waiting for the book to come in. So we'll do that. That'll be interesting. I dropped a link in Instagram of the interview that Robert Redford did with Richard Helms, because Richard Helms was personal his uh his personal expert on the set of 3 Days of the Condor. Great movie, and it talks about how the iconic Richard Helms and all this stuff. Um, so we'll do that coming up. But that's about it, you guys. I think again, if you got any ideas for things you want me to cover, please drop those in the description. Again, you can support me anytime. We're getting close to summer here, and we got a lot of content coming up. So appreciate y'all. Thanks for being here for this Grendel stream, this dragon stream. If you want me to do more dragons or beasts, let me know. And then Valentine says, would you be willing to do the Godfather movies for a dono? Oh, yes. Big time. Of course. Of course I would do the Godfather movies. I do I do yeah, I would do all 3. Godfather 1, 2, and 3. And maybe if somebody wanted to drop a fat chat for that, I'd get the Nicholas Pileggi book, Wise Guys for Goodfellas. I could probably make my way through that. That would be interesting. That's a good idea. That's a good idea to cover that. And I would read the Mario Puzo book because I've never read it. But if you want me to just do films, just let me know what you want me to do. I mean, we're a literature stream, so yeah. And you come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding, like I was shot, like I was shot with a diamond bullet right in my forehead. And I remember thinking the genius of that, the will to do that. Perfect, crystalline, complete. So yes, any ideas for literature you want me to do, especially classic literature? Sometimes I have trouble thinking of like classic books, novels that you guys want me to cover. Um, because there's so much. I'll also be doing the Icelandic sagas, probably Eagle Saga as part of a sponsor stream, and I love Tahiti.
I did the movie, Mutiny on the Bounty. I did the movie Mutiny on the Bounty. I met my wife there.
Gravity's Rainbow. Yeah, I got Thomas Pynchon right up there, so I need to do that. If you want to drop me a sponsor stream, that one's going to take a sponsor stream because it's a massive book. So, but that would be like the postmodern work that we haven't covered. Oh, Valentine says, "Did you ever finish The Wasteland?" Good point. I was thinking about that today because I was just scanning past the bookshelf in there, and I was thinking of what I need to cover, and I remembered that I never finished the analysis of The Wasteland, so I can go back and cover T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and Ezra Pound. I need to do. I'll probably do the Unvanquished from or As I Lay Dying, if you want me to do that, from William Faulkner. We need to do more Faulkner. We did Wild Palms. I'll probably, William Faulkner would be a good one for me to cover this summer because in about a month and a half, I'll be going down south to see my family down there in Faulkner Territory, Mississippi. So that would be a good one to cover for that. Um, the Secret History, I was looking for. Thank you, Breezy. Yes, I was looking for a copy of Donna Tartt this weekend, and I couldn't find one. So I actually went to, just for old time's sake, I went to a Barnes and Noble just to see what it was like. And of course, yes, it was filled with Funko Pops. And what was disheartening about it, even more so than usual, was the fact that the book, all the book covers have been redesigned. The mass market big book covers have been redesigned to look like they would for, um, they look like cardboard painted plasticine covers. And I know it's just the cover of the book, but it's like, it was just disheartening. So I try to get all my books from a local bookstore, a secondhand bookstore, or just order them online. I'll get books anywhere. But I went into Barnes and Noble and I actually didn't. I went in there looking. You know what I did? I went into Barnes and Noble looking for. I asked them just kind of for my own amusement to ask them if they had a copy of 6 Days of the Condor, and they were like, "What? Of the what?" I was like, "6 Days of the Condor," and they were like, "A condom?" And I was like, "You know what? Just Condor. Just look it up. Can you just tell me if it's still in print or not?" And they were like, "We don't know what that is." So I did not get anything there. Yeah, please make sure that you hit those notifications because I know that, you know, I really, I don't really post a lot. Like one of the things about having notifications on is that if you're I think a lot of people probably turn notifications off because they get notifications for a lot of community posts. Probably, I don't know. Maybe not, maybe so. People can do whatever they want, but but I don't really post a lot of community posts. I do that mostly just on Instagram. You can follow me on Instagram, and that's because I just don't like doing it. And also, most people don't um, kind of turn their notifications off for that. Maybe I don't know. People can do whatever they want, and if I probably should post more on the community tab. But we're just trying to build the channel here, so that'll probably come when it comes. That's for people with big channels, maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of talking out of my ass. Um, but big, huge channels that you follow, you want to see their community posts. But if you want me to post more there or whatever, but please turn your notifications on so you can get with us here. Somebody brought up Master and Margarita. I've got Master and Margarita. Uh, got Master and Margarita right here. So that one would be a good one to cover. Maybe I'll cover that with DPH in the future. I don't know. Um, but a lot of people have brought that up. So that would be, Bulgakov would be a good one to cover. Um, the We need to. I talked to our friend Mowgli about the shards, Bret Easton Ellis. So I don't know whether I want to cover that one or not. I'll probably just read it anyway and see if I want to cover it. But that's the latest Bret Easton Ellis. If you want me to cover more poetry or any specific era, just let me know. I could do Sherlock Holmes. I could do the Sign of Four. So anyway, so that's about it, you guys. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And if you sent me a super chat and I didn't get it, or I didn't get to it, I will get to it next time. Before I go, I left these for the end. Shouts out to our homeboy IPAK Arts, IPAK, at Instagram, who does my thumbnail art. He's amazing. You can look at all of his his art on Instagram. And shouts out to our homeboy Rooks G, who does our intro and now our exit. I'm going to use this as exit music here tonight because I love his music. Please follow him on SoundCloud. And you can see all the links in the video description. Follow him on SoundCloud, on the Apple Music, on YouTube, on Instagram. He's a homeboy and makes dope music, great jungle drum and bass music. So please follow him because he needs to get up there. And so I love his music. So anyway, that's about it, you guys. I think that's it. I'm gonna play us out here. To play us out, here's Sting and a cut off his new album. Take it away. We do it live here, you guys. We always do it live. And I will see y'all next time. I love y'all. All right. Love y'all. Peace.